de la Facultad de Educación y me da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida a este Pensando Educación, en el que vamos a estar acompañados por el profesor Bassel Akar. La sesión de hoy va a ser en inglés, así que me voy a pasar a hablar en inglés. Si en algún momento necesitan apoyo en términos de idioma, yo puedo ayudar. Me da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida a este Pensando Educación, en el que vamos a estar acompañados por el profesor. Y ahora que escuché eso, voy a hablar más lento, porque acabo de caer en cuenta que estaba hablando muy rápido. So I'm going to switch into English now. Welcome to this session of Pensando Educación. The theme today will be around teachers taking risks. And for this, we have Bassel Akar, who has served as an associate professor of education at the Faculty of Humanities and was director of the Center for Applied Research and Education at Notre Dame University in Louaize, Lebanon. His research and development work in education over the past 15 years has focused on lower middle income conflict-affected countries, namely Lebanon and those in the wider Arab region, including Jordan, Yemen, Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Egypt. The studies that he's worked on have contributed to core knowledge fields in these fragile contexts, undergoing various forms of armed conflict, systemic corruption, and violations of children's rights to education. Bassel works closely with international government and local organizations in carrying out empirical studies in education and facilitating professional development activities for citizenship and history education teachers. He's published a book on citizenship education and co-authored many articles, and we invite you to read his work. And as I said earlier, the theme today is looking at how teachers experience and exercise their agency in situations of crisis. And I think this is something of great relevance for our current context in Colombia. Just this past month, we've been seeing the ways that teachers have been affected by armed conflict in this setting, but across the years and across the country, this has taken form in different ways. And that experience puts pressure on them in terms of their decision-making, in terms of the ways that they can exercise agency. And I think in that sense, for us as a field and as folks that are thinking about these themes, it's interesting to be able to hear about it from a different part of the world and see where there might be parallels, where there might be differences, and be able to have a conversation around that. So the nature of the event is that we'll have this first presentation. Bassel or Dr. Akar, I don't know what you prefer. Bassel is happy for interruptions. So if you have questions, I don't know if happy for interruptions might not be the way to put it, but if you want to ask a question during the talk, please feel free to ask it, raise your hand. Also, for those of you that are connected online, feel free to use the chat and let us know that you have questions. And otherwise, in any case, we'll save some space for questions and answers at the end. ¿Algo más que hay que decir? No? So then I'll pass over to Bassel.
Okay. Okay. First, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. And it was by good coincidence that I was able to meet you and also be here in Colombia visiting. So I'm really, really happy about that. The research that I'm presenting here is really a compilation of about 10 to 15 years of work with teachers and reform in Lebanon. Yeah, and we also draw on evidence gathered from our work in, let's say, from teachers who we have encouraged to write about their experiences in, let's say, journals that are supporting teachers to disseminate some of their experiences. There is, I think it was last year, or 2023, I co-edited a special issue in the journal Public History Weekly with Maria Georgiou from Cyprus. And it was a collection of teachers' articles. So teachers wrote about innovations they had done in their context, which is, let's say, it's a very difficult context to innovate in. Yeah. But let's continue. And the focus of the crises or conflicts that we're looking at are in low middle income countries. Yeah, because when we say conflict affected areas, we can probably mention any country in the world. Yeah, and the closest country that we often compare with Lebanon is usually Northern Ireland, but it is not a low to middle income country. So this is why it's also important to emphasize, coming from low middle income countries. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to give you examples of crises. So what do we mean by crises? Then I'll just outline a few indicators of teacher agency, that I'm working with in education. And then I'll give a few examples of some of the innovations and risks that teachers have taken. And then at the very end, I'll reflect on the significance of teachers taking risks and innovating in education reform and development. So we can look at crises as shocks and stressors. So as stressors, these are often long-term. So they have been compounded. They have been running for maybe decades. So for example, in Lebanon, the last national curriculum reform was in 1997, after the Civil War. But our history education curriculum was last revised in 1968 to 1970. All right. So students today in Lebanese public schools are still learning the national curriculum that was last written in 1970, 1971. Right? So this is what I mean by stagnant reforms. Traditions of dogmatic pedagogies, the emphasis on memorization. This idea of do no harm. So we often see this in history education or citizenship education. Do you have a citizenship education program in your national curriculum here? What's it called?
Citizenship.
Yeah.
Standards. We have standards. It's actually a program, but standards that have to be met by the students.
Yeah. So often in the curriculum, they present, let's say, ideals of what an ideal or a citizen is. But in the classroom, we have an avoidance of sensitive and controversial issues. So the students actually don't have an opportunity to engage in dialogues and debates. Unchanging conservative political ideologies. Here, it's usually centered around nationalism. So when an education system first gets conceptualized in a country, usually a nationalist political ideology is what gives it its form. So we are Lebanese. This is our national identity. We must speak Arabic. We must, Well, with time, we start to see an increase in diversity, right? And diversity can be a result of globalization or migration, usually. This is where the diversity in a country increases. Well, the political ideology usually doesn't change with that time, And so sometimes they often see, let's say, cosmopolitan principles in tension with nationalist ideologies. So as diversity increases, we're starting to see more exclusion and more marginalization because the nationalist principles are not changing. I'm going to skip down to the last two. Chronic marginalization. This is usually for children who are vulnerable to, let's say, inequity. So children with disabilities, children who have been forcibly displaced, whether from a neighboring country or internally, children who are living in poverty, children who have been victims of being child soldiers or victims of abuse at home, in many different ways. Just to give you an idea, in Lebanon, we have a population of 5.5 million people. This is, I think, half your city, maybe, or less than half your city. And we have 2 million refugees in the country, 1.5 million from Syria, and under half a million from Palestine, which is now the number about 250,000. So the number of Syrian refugee children alone, school-age children, are about 667,000 Syrian refugee children who need school. Yeah, and only a third have access to school. Poor governance. This is a gentle way of, I guess, naming corruption. And corruption is not just bribery. Corruption is the absence of transparency. It's the absence of accountability. Yeah, and the absence of inclusive participation in decision making. So, and then we have shocks. Yeah, so these are crises as shocks, things that happen at once. And obviously, we just emerged out of the school closures from COVID. In Lebanon, we experienced a financial collapse where we lost over 95% of the value of our currency in about 6 months. We also have chronic school closures, schools that are closed by teachers. So in 2022, the teachers and the protest, they closed the schools for about 8 weeks. In 2023, and then in 2021, the same. There's a really neat study, actually. It was on the Argentinian school system, where they studied the economic impact of students who missed, I think, 2 weeks of school that were closed by teachers. And that alone has a devastating impact on job opportunities and employability for children who miss, let's say, up to 2 weeks of school. So what happens when schools reopen after, let's say, COVID or teacher strikes is we have learning losses. Yeah. And hi, welcome. So, for example, in Lebanon, children who came back to school to the 5th grade were at a conceptual level of 3rd grade. Yeah. And for those of you who have studied early childhood development, those who missed 1st grade and 2nd grade are entering 3rd grade not knowing how to hold a pencil. Yeah. So learning losses are also were absolutely devastating. And it's not just about learning conceptual knowledge. It's about losing the, let's say, the habits of schooling. And then, of course, we had an increase of screen addiction. Yeah, so when children came back to school after 2 years of school closure, they had a very difficult time leaving, let's say, phones at home. And there was all this withdrawal behavior at schools because they had become addicted to their, their social life on the phone, which they had gotten used to during school closures. And then, of course, armed conflict. I don't think I mentioned, I'm talking about Lebanon. So we just emerged from another conflict with our neighbor Israel, and it turned, let's say, about 1,900 or 1,800 public schools. 500 of the public schools were turned into shelters. Yeah, so we had 1/3 of the public school turning into shelters. And now that the ceasefire has happened, now there's a plan of, well, how do we now transform these 500 public schools back into schools, but also balancing that we also need shelters for people who have lost their homes physically. Yeah. Okay. So this is just an introduction into some of the shocks and stressors. Okay, so how do we address shocks and stressors? We usually turn to policy development. Yeah. So when we want to, let's say, reform an education system, we say, we're going to try and reform policy, because we have an assumption that if we fix policy, everything else will more or less fall into place. And policy development usually, well, Lebanon at least, it has come in these 3, and we see these across almost all conflict-affected countries. First are peace treaties. Yeah? And all our peace treaties, or in all peace treaties, we always see some stipulation on education reform. Yeah? And many times it's related to social studies or history, to kind of get a narrative that avoids conflict. And that's then related to curriculum reform. The national curriculum is usually the first part that gets reformed after a conflict. but it's not the first sector that gets reformed. Yeah. In political economics, education is one of the last to be visited during reforms. We are in competition with the military spending. Yeah, this is the first priority. Education really is battling at the very end. When you look at government spending on education, it's in the bottom pool of 3 sectors. Yeah, and then we have 5-year strategies. Oof. Okay. Well, what's the problem with the government sector, with policy development? Yeah. Why doesn't it always work? Well, one, we have institutionalized corruption. Again, it's not about bribery only. Yeah, it's about the absence of transparency and accountability. Yeah. So I was involved in several government-led reform projects where basically at the end, government individuals or representatives at the Ministry of Education, if they feel offended by some process, they can actually say, well, yeah, forget it. It's over. And this is the vulnerability of policy development. Yeah. Carnivals and graveyards. I'm going to skip to that. Carnivals are usually celebrations of the achievements. Yeah. Sometimes they're tokenistic. For those in equity reform or development, we often see initiatives for children who have been marginalized, and then there are media campaigns to show progress and work done, usually at an event, and this is often seen as a temporary indicator of success. Yeah, and I don't know if this happens here as well in Colombia, but we have a lot of resources developed for teachers. So there's this theory of change. If we develop resource packs like lesson plans and toolkits, and we distribute them to schools, teachers are going to use them. Yeah. Well, this is where I wrote about graveyards in one of my articles. Yeah. They get shelved, and that's it. It's done. Teachers may have tried them. Maybe they have done them for the project, but they get at the end buried in a cemetery of resources. Yeah. And then the final one is teachers as messengers and subjects. There's this idea that if I prepare lesson plans for teachers and I send them to them, they're going to use them. But no, teachers are already struggling with personal issues, with low salaries. They're struggling with the feeling of, let's say, absence of dignity at work. Yeah. Yeah, so there is no reason for them to go over and beyond and use these resources that have been provided to them. This is also related to partnerships with international and civil society organizations. I'll just point out the last one. It says counter sustainable. And so counter sustainable is that most of these projects, at least from my experience, they run as long as funding runs. Yeah. So once funding finishes, then the intervention is finished. And if you try and follow up, when we try and follow up a few years later, there's almost no evidence of continuity. Yeah. Now, these are just some basic theories of reform. And why is it that right now in Lebanon in 2024, we are still struggling with curriculum reform? And it's okay. And a regression in teacher qualifications. So over time, our teacher workforce is less and less qualified. Yeah. So Bernstein in 1971, he wrote about how education reform reflects political governance. So how government runs, or the issues that we see in how government is run, it's reflected in what happens also in the education sector's governance. Yeah. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Apple and of course Foucault, that at the top level, when education reform is happening at the top level, there is an intention for control. Yeah. This is one of their intentions. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that the government sector, yeah, or international and local organizations are not important pathways for reform and development. Yeah. But what I am saying in this presentation is that teachers have been a pathway that has either been suppressed or marginalized or disempowered. Okay. But the teacher's work is an important pathway for reform and development, and it becomes important when they are empowered. I wrote down some of my favorite curriculum theorists whose research and curriculum theories were based on what teachers innovated in the classroom. Yeah. So we have Lauren Stenhouse, Michael Skilbeck, and Jerome Bruner. And some of the evidence of what teachers have done through innovation, and we'll talk a little bit about what innovation is, and through my work is with history teacher associations. Yeah. So in Cyprus, there is the Association for Historical Dialogue and Reconciliation, which was actually an inspiration for us in Lebanon. We set up the Lebanese Association for History in 2013 in partnership with with support from the group in Cyprus. In the Netherlands, there was Euroclio. Euroclio gradually became an international network of teacher associations. A fantastic work. And of course, in the UK as well, the Historical Association. And the case of the UK, there is an article by Michael, can't remember his last name right now, but and he documented the impact of the journal, yeah, where the contributors were mostly history teachers, and how the research that teachers wrote impacted the development of learning history as a discipline. Yeah. So yeah, this is just these are just some pictures of the Lebanese Association for History that we co-founded in Lebanon. And I'm just going to highlight really quickly how this happened. So in 2011, we organized a conference on history, learning, and teaching. And why history? It's one of our most contentious programs. Yeah. So it was not hasn't been reformed since 1968. They tried to reform it in 2010 and 2012. It created protests on the streets and fights on the streets between political parties because of some historical events that were being left out and some that were being kept in. The way we reform history education in Lebanon is that we take representatives from different religions and they form a committee. These are not historians or history teachers. Yeah, some of them are historians, and they need to agree on a narrative of the past that does not offend the different religious factions. Yeah, we have 18 official religious sects in Lebanon. So, of course, and a consensual history is unnatural, isn't it? It goes against what history is. Yeah. So this is the significance of history teachers in this presentation. Throughout the work of this association, we managed to secure a large amount of funding to provide history teachers with, let's say, a professional development program on how to promote disciplinary thinking. So learning history as a discipline. So we're transforming from memorizing text Two, disciplinary knowledge, meaning we take historical, let's say, questions, inquiry questions, and we use certain tools, like let's say looking at a cause, and the students are given evidence and they construct. Yeah? So this goes against the ministry's mission. Yeah. So in our peace treaty, yeah, our peace treaty says that we need to unify all the history textbooks into one narrative. That's actually in our peace treaty. Because during the Civil War, different political groups wrote their own history books, saying who's the villain and who's the victim. Yeah. So, well, how do you get these teachers? Who are these teachers? Yeah. Well, you find them. They come up. We organize conferences. We organize seminars. These are the teachers that come like on a Friday night, right? Instead of being home sometimes because they really want to do something. And they know that something's wrong and they're going over and beyond what's expected from them. Yeah. So this is one. Number two, they're given coaching and mentorship, which is really almost volunteering from researchers and academics. Yeah. And they're given that kind of support. And of course, they're given autonomy. They need some kind of autonomy to innovate. You can't innovate without autonomy. Yeah. This is one of our teachers in South Lebanon. She wrote an article in the journal I told you about. And obviously, it was about teaching the Civil War, yeah, which is one of the most controversial subjects in Lebanon. I'm not going to read quotations. You can read them, and I will also leave the PowerPoint here. You can look at it later. This is a book chapter that I wrote on a teacher, Nadine, also in the south of Lebanon, who took a theme in the national curriculum. It wasn't even in the book. It's just an idea, a theme on human rights. We don't even have children's rights in our national curriculum, but she took the theme of human rights and she focused on the exploitation of children during armed conflict. Yeah. So are child soldiers victims or perpetrators? And this was a theme she developed in her school. Yeah. Now, why are these risks? Well, it's a risk to their job because it's a risk to parents' reactions, to school inspectors that come to school. Yeah. And it's a risk, we don't often think about this, but among children in the classroom. There are many teachers that say, what, a debate in my class? I'm not going to host this. You know, kids will start fighting. No, I'm not going to do this. Yeah. Well, when you have 25% of teachers in the teacher workforce that have teaching diplomas, this is one. Yeah. So we have a teacher workforce where the majority are not qualified to teach. And two, when you look at the curriculum program for teacher qualifications, no, there are no, let's say, exercises or approaches for facilitating controversial issues. Yeah. But yes, children were collaborating. This is one of my favorite pictures or evidence of collaborating, where this is a group of 4 students negotiating terms and sentences and really working together on this. And this is the first time they do this, and it's not easy. When you have teenagers, like let's say 10th graders or 11th graders, for the first time talking to a peer in a classroom, yeah, this is a big deal, and they don't know how, and they need support with that as well. Yes, and when you have the desks that are kind of structured all like this and planted in the ground, so part of the innovation is also where teachers turn desks around. Yeah, and that's a big risk too, because the principals say, hey, you're wasting time. We don't have time for this. You're making noise. Come on. Yeah. And this was their assessment. Yeah. Parents would protest against this. Yeah, because it's not a paper test with a grade on top. How are you grading this? Yeah. One observation that some teachers saw, and I'm going to say this here, is that the students who normally would not engage started to come to class with examples to share with the classroom when they were doing activities like this. And the students that would normally get 20 out of 20 were protesting. We're saying, wait a minute, no, we can't do this, because they're used to memorizing text. Yeah. And they're the children who struggled the most in the classroom. These are quotations from the students. I'm not going to read them. I'll just leave them up for a few seconds. Okay. This was another controversial issue that another public school teacher did. So the first one was a private school teacher. Just so you know, 70% of the students in Lebanon are registered in private schools. Yeah, we have about 1,200,000 students, or 1,100,000 students. Yeah. 30% of those, or a little less than 30%, are in public schools. Okay. During the economic collapse, we saw a rise of students registered in public schools. But now it's kind of gone back to the 2/3. This was controversial because this talked about violence in the family, domestic violence. Yeah, and so the teacher asked students to bring examples from home and to enact them as drama in the classroom. And even when I would come to class and visit and observe, you know, she would tell me, today's a perfect day because the inspectors are not here. So yeah, these are the risks that they take. And it's not easy for the children. You can read these while I'm talking, but some of the children went through, let's say, a few emotional traumas, either reenacting the dramas that happen at home or observing some of the traumas that happen at home, because it reminded them of the difficulties that they're also experiencing at home. Okay. This is one of our controversial ministers, and this was a lesson on corruption that another teacher had led, and the theme was about autonomy and justice. I'm not going to go into detail here because I'm a little conscious of time. I don't expect you to read these cards, but this is a diamond ranking exercise that was also, again, with some of our support, we show teachers how you can get students to engage with controversial issues. So you write like 9 themes, yeah? And then you cut them out in little pieces of paper, and then you ask children to organize them as a diamond ranking. So 1, what they believe is the most important, and then 2, and then 1, 2, 3, and then 2, and then 1. So they sit in groups, they negotiate their order, and then they agree, or they write down why they put this first and why they put this last. And here you have 2 lessons or 2 sessions of debates and dialogues in the classroom, explaining, justifying, and even giving them a chance to rearrange if they want. And even if they want, maybe to write down their own little card here. Yeah. This is a public school classroom, very typical in Lebanon, with the gray, dull gray painting and graffiti on the wall. You see the chairs are stacked up on desks in the back because this was not very typical. This is a close colleague of mine, a teacher in Lebanon, and this is a unique setup. Again, it may not be unique for most schools or many schools around the world, but in Lebanon, it is very unique. Yeah. And this was on a unit plan on environmental sustainability. Yeah. Which I'm going to say, the little bits of reform that we have had in the curriculum over the past 15 years have been, let's say, taking content out of the curriculum. Yeah. So the Ministry of Education can say, okay, this year we're going to take out Unit 2, or this year we're going to take out this part in this grade. Well, the units that are usually taken out first are the ones related to environmental sustainability. Yeah. I put this slide in because this is just a pedagogical framework that we provided with some teachers. So for teachers to innovate and take risks, they need a conceptual framework. Yeah? They need, let's say, it could be a pedagogical framework. It could be a security-related framework. There was the Violence-Free Schools Initiative in Lebanon. And so they were provided with a framework on what counts as violence. And then they came up with their own, let's say, consequences of how you report and how you address. Yeah. So there needs to be some type of framework in addition to the autonomy that I'll just reflect on later on. This was another a unit plan created by another teacher. And again, it starts off with an inquiry question, and then they spend the next 2 months looking at evidence to answer the inquiry question. This is actually the final assessment question. The final assessment question is given in the very beginning. There's your final exam. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks gathering evidence to answer this question. Yeah? Sounds cool, but it's very difficult. Yeah, because first you need to define some of the concepts here. Well, who are victims? Yeah. They looked at sources, and then they looked at stories from home. So the students went home and asked parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts, who were the victims of the Civil War? And believe it or not, a few parents did not want to talk. Yeah. They said, what is this? No, we're not talking about this here in this house. Yeah. And then you compare, this is one of the concepts, the historical concepts, comparing similarities and differences. So these are just pictures of the students in class, which is very atypical. Yeah. These are some of the reflections from teachers. I'm not going to read them, but I will tell you this teacher, Nadine, she actually co-taught. So she worked with a teacher from another school, yeah, on the same unit plan. And they agreed, let's put this unit plan together. Nadine had a class of 10 students. The other teacher had a class of 30 students. And there was a lot of negotiation, a lot of debate about the activities, a lot of revision. But this is probably one of the only examples of co-teaching that I was able to find. So my research is finding these teachers who are innovating. And it's very difficult. Very. Okay. This teacher worked very closely with the students in developing the unit plan, in developing the objectives of the unit plan. So she gave out the theme and the problem. How are we going to study this? And this was in a very conservative school in the south of Lebanon. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to conclude with, okay, so after this slide, I'll start concluding. So what are the, let's say, the outputs or the outcomes of teacher innovation, right? Why is this an important pathway? So these are different forms of knowledge. Okay? You have substance, which is the straight information, the, let's say, information on maybe specifically who were victims, specifically what happened in this town. Yeah, this is substantial knowledge. So they build this field, yeah, with let's say, sources that were excluded from, that schools excluded or the government had excluded. Disciplinary knowledge, okay, which is the methodology of learning the subject. So how, for example, in history, well, what do historians do? They gather evidence, they question it, they put together claims. Yeah. So this is disciplinary knowledge, and they develop this. And then, of course, they develop pedagogical knowledge. Yeah. How am I going to facilitate a debate in class? How am I going to get students to research and come back and share? Yeah. And the significance of this is that this becomes a curriculum. Yeah. Teachers in class are developing curriculum. They're developing resources. When you develop resources for teachers, well, it's not sustainable. It goes straight to the cemetery because it wasn't produced in the classroom. It's not just about buy-in from teachers. No, it's about validity for classroom learning and teaching. And so when you do lead on curriculum reform, we need to approach teachers and say, what have you done with this unit? How can we improve it? Yeah. Okay. So from our experience, these are three variables that we noticed or that we had observed. Yeah. First is inspiration. When you present to teachers what teachers can do, you may get some that are inspired. I would say most of the teachers I have worked with usually say, oh yeah, we've done this, but I do this already, you know. I don't need to do this. Yeah. So there is no humility. Yeah. There's no room for exploring and improving. But teachers who are inspired will go out and try something new. Yeah. Autonomy. This goes against the system. So don't forget, in an authoritarian education system, teachers are disempowered. Yeah. Structurally. Okay. So when you give them autonomy, then you give them that space. And sometimes teachers create their own autonomy. They find it. They find that space. Like the teacher who made sure the inspectors were not coming to make sure she could do those classes. And then involving teachers as co-researchers. Yeah. Teachers in most of the research that's been conducted across the Arab region, they are usually subjects. So somebody goes to the class, do you mind if I observe your class? Okay, we observe the class, we take down notes, we leave the class, and then we write up a research report. But rarely are teachers, rarely teachers work as co-researchers. And co-researchers, I mean conceptualizing the study, using the indicators that you're using to identify learning. Yeah, well, is learning happening or not? Yeah, and if it's not happening, how do I revise the activity so that we can see more learning, right? These are other variables. I'm not going to go into them now. And that's it. So yeah, my concluding statement in this presentation is that the agency of teachers in reform and development is usually oppressed or marginalized, whether by design or unintentionally. Yeah. And to actually empower teachers to exercise agency, it requires risk-taking, you know, particularly in these education systems. But this is a sustainable approach. Yeah, it's not a replacement for government. It's not a replacement for international organizations. It's just one of the many pathways that has been covered up. Yeah, but it's also very sustainable. Thank you. Yeah.
We have to do it again with microphone, no?
Okay.
And maybe what we can do is pull up the two chairs and come over here. So because we have an audience that's online, we need to share the microphone when we're asking questions. Oh, sorry. So if you want to ask a question, let me know and I'll bring the microphone over. And likewise, Alejandro, you're helping us catch the questions online or? Sí. Oh, yeah, sí, pero si llegan, tú nos avisas. Listo, perfecto. So thank you for that very interesting presentation. Would anybody like to ask a question? Otherwise, I have a list. Dale.
Okay. Listo. Hello, my name is David. I'm from the peace building master's degree. And I have a question. I know that you specialize basically in the like the role of teaching and well everything that you told us, but do you know when you told that I'm sorry, like how do you prioritize education in government and policy development? Is there like any way that teachers or like that movement specifically can suggest the government or policymakers to make that change? Or is there any other strategy that can be made to like put that on the like on the treaty, on peace treaties?
Yeah, good question. So just because it's in a peace treaty, it doesn't mean it's going to be enforced. Yeah. And two, just because it's in a peace treaty, it doesn't mean it's important. Yeah. If you do an analysis of peace treaties that have taken place, there are some stipulations that are not sustainable. Don't forget, peace treaties are also written as negotiating documents to finally find some kind of consensus and agreement among the fighting communities. Yeah. Prioritizing education reform, especially, let's say, with the teacher workforce, this takes a lot of advocacy work. And this is really strongly related to peace building. You know, in peace building, often, yes, maybe your objective is to influence policy development. Yeah. But what I'm showing here and what we've seen as evidence in other countries is that policy development really should be let's say, an action, yeah, that puts in rhetoric and writing the culture that we're seeing take place. Okay? So, for example, once we start to see, let's say, students engaged in, let's say, more collaborative research with other students, then we can take that and transform it into policy. But unsustainable policy is a great idea. When we say, this is a great idea, this is logical, and so let's put it down as policy. Okay? So, and good question about prioritization, right? You know, when we received the funding for the history project, we were competing with the Syrian refugees, or the money that was allocated for Syrian refugee children in Lebanon. Who's going to invest in history teachers when we have 500,000 Syrian refugee children who need schooling? Yeah, and who need psychosocial support. Yeah, and who need shoes and shirts in a country that did not want them there in the first place. Yeah, so we had politicians express openly their feelings of racism and saying they should not be here, right? So no, there's a lot of advocacy work that's put into it, and it's gradual. So what we relied on teachers publicly sharing their experiences in classrooms and working closely with the ministry. The ministry didn't like the work in the beginning, yeah, but we continued to invite them to the public seminars that we'd organize with the teachers. Yeah? So they would attend. And 10 years later, the association was approached by the ministry saying, could you train our teachers? And to me, this was an absolute breakthrough. And it's an indicator that these types of changes take time. I don't know if any of you have been involved in reform projects, by international agencies, but they're usually given a 6-month period or a 1-year period or a 2-year period. But no, we're talking 8 to 10 years. These are cultural changes and transformations. And then hopefully they can be policy. Yeah.
If there aren't other questions, I'm going to throw one in there while people warm up. Or querías hacerle
Yeah.
a follow-up? Dale.
Thank you. Yeah, so you also mentioned that you had like some troubles introducing these different concepts of teaching to parents specifically. I want to ask about how did the teachers dealt with maybe parents that were that did not agree with the teaching methods? Did they speak with the parents? Was there a letter? Or did the parents try to, like, I don't know, like sabotage those new teaching methods? What was the approach?
It's connected. My question was around what happens when there's an escalation of controversy. So it's one thing when a parent is a little bit uncomfortable because of the testing method. It's another thing when you've brought up the Civil War and you're going completely against what we teach at home. And this is something we see here in the Colombian context in terms of teaching history or teaching gender-related topics or teaching in conflict-affected context where there's still groups that are representing sort of power within the sphere. And so the escalation of controversy can really put the teacher at risk. And I think that can look very different when there's an armed group or when there isn't. But even when there isn't the presence of an armed group, there can be a very strong sort of familial reaction and so on. And depending on the politics within the school, that can also isolate the teacher and so on. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to sort of what happens, the nature of that risk. And I think if I understood your question, it's how do the teachers respond? And what I want to add to that question is what other protections are possible or did teachers lean on in order to keep persevering even in the face of risk?
Good question. I'll answer in 3 ways. One is that when the teacher has the support of the principal, it becomes a lot easier. Yeah. Don't forget that in some of these schools, or most of these schools, they're private schools. So the school can say, if you're not happy, you can leave. Yeah. When the principal gives the teacher the support and says, you know, you do what you need to do, then, you know, parents can object, but at the end, the teacher can continue. Yeah. There is a really good example of trying to remember it actually. And yes, with disabilities, children with disabilities, there were a large number of public schools that slowly became inclusive schools. Yeah, so they allowed a certain percentage of children who have disabilities to register within the school. Well, who were the first to object? Parents of children without disabilities. Yeah. What? You're going to put these children, my child is going to fall behind and all these things. Yeah. So some of the principals, you know, they reported really just over time, letting parents know what are the advantages for their children, what's exactly happening. And it takes time. You know, it's not something that will be resolved in a meeting after school. Yeah. These take time from the teachers and the principals and explaining to the parents why they're doing it. And really a lot of it is just parent awareness, you know, just letting parents know and sorry to say this, but yeah, educating parents. Yeah. Parent education is a big theme that keeps coming up. You know, parents not knowing, let's say, the benefits of some of the activities that are happening inside the classroom. Yeah. There were some parents, obviously, that objected, and they expressed them to the teacher, and the teacher would just need to take their time and explain. And that's it. I mean, this is what's happening in our class. But as long as they have the support from the principal, and And don't forget, a lot of teachers don't have support from their principal. Yeah, the teacher wants to do something different. The principal is usually the first to object. No, please. Let's just keep it low profile. Yeah. But no, there are some principals out there that are ready to be part of the big transformation. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Fernando Serrano. I coordinate the Master in Peace Building at the university. And we just finished a research on risk on teachers teaching gender. And there are many similarities in what you had told us in terms of the important role of agency there, but it takes a lot of risk doing that. And in fact, in some cases, it exposes them to lots of vulnerabilities. In our research, we have found that, in fact, it's female teachers, the ones doing this. So I would like to ask you a little bit about the gender side of what you have described. In the topic we were dealing with is mostly women. Maybe in your case could be different in terms of who are these ones kind of pushing the topics, who are the ones who are, as you say, the ones who dare to teach these highly competitive issues. So that's one of my questions in terms of the gender side of that. But also, at least in Colombia, a big difference is in terms of what happens in the everyday life of the schools and the informal life of this. We have found a lot of threats and problems in the everyday interaction between teachers and their peers. In fact, there is the role of parents there, but in our case, we found that the peers could be the worst enemy that you could have in this case. They are the ones pushing them, like even putting anonymous complaints, etc. So I would like to hear maybe a little bit more also in terms of what's happening in the informal side and also in the formal side. In terms of, is there any kind of protection system for public policies to protect teachers who have been threatened, something like that? Because sometimes it really escalates from the level of the school to something that is even legal implications of this kind of topic. So it's just kind of expanding what you have said because it's so interesting for our context. Thank you.
Okay. For gender, I don't think we have studies on, let's say, patterns in gender and, teacher agency. We would probably find more females exercising agency, but that could just be because we may have more female teachers in those areas. Yeah. But from my experience, yeah, we've had many males, but we've also had, let's say, sometimes you'll find the males more likely to be critical of these new approaches, or let's say they exercise less humility. Yeah, because to exercise agency, you need, it's important to know that I'm learning and I'm making mistakes and I need support to learn. And you're less likely to find this among male teachers. Yeah, we've had a lot of male teachers say, no, this is the right way to do it. And I mean, obviously, and when the female and male teachers are working together in groups, it's usually, if there's a dominant person in the group, it's the older male. Yeah. But what's interesting is that the most resistance we've received also were from those who have had, let's say, doctoral degrees. So those who, history teachers who have a PhD in history, those are the ones who will sometimes stand up in the middle of a program development and they will walk out. And they say, what? You want students to examine a claim and write their own historical claim? No, please. And they're the ones who will protest. Yeah, which is interesting. For teacher security, I've only come across one incident where I think it was the principal who was under threat, physically from parents. Yeah. The parents came to the school armed with the intention to kill or hurt the principal. Yeah. And so the principal could not go to the general security and had to use the local mafias to help him. Yeah. So this is another form or another source of security, yeah, the local community, because sometimes the local police is not reliable, yeah. But yeah, we have a child protection policy in schools, but I don't think we have one for teachers. You know, it's and I think it's probably because teachers are usually seen as the perpetrators, yeah, with school-based violence. There is still forms of capital punishment. There's a lot of verbal abuse from teachers to students, particularly towards the most vulnerable children, like those who come from low-income families and refugees. But yeah. Yeah, I think it might be different than here in that sense. Yeah.
And hi, Bassel, thanks a lot. My name is Diego. I'm a researcher in comparative education too. I also work in an organization that facilitates dialogues. I wanted to hear a dialogue between like different opposing parties and stuff like that. I wanted to hear a little bit more about if you could expand on how these teachers, like when they were working about history and creating like shared narratives, I just find that fascinating. I'd like to hear more about what those conversations were like, how they were facilitated, like how do you accompany that work or what they were doing in terms of history. I think that's extremely interesting in the case of Lebanon, and it'd be nice to hear about that. And the other question is more about, it's kind of an annoying one, I guess, in terms of sustainability and like scalability, let's say. Like I understand government or state imposed curriculum might be not very useful for a sustainable, like empowered curriculum by teachers. But at the same time, I think Colombia, I felt when I do research, the opposite, that like teachers feel very left alone in what they can do. So where does the infrastructure come from? Like, I understand I want autonomy, but I still need some infrastructure to be able to sustain my efforts over time. That can come from other teachers, from researchers, but I feel like teachers are like, this autonomy is also a challenge because you have too many inputs. Like the government, they give you an input, then an international organization gives you an input because they have a project and they want something, or maybe a researcher. So you're dealing like with 3 or 4 ways in which they are telling you, maybe you should teach this way or that way. And then I think navigating that in this context is something that is very difficult for teachers. But my question is in terms of sustainability, how do we make these different inputs work together? Or whether definitely they normally are in tension and it's very difficult to put them to work together. So I don't know in the case, I think in Colombia, I just think I always say like, this is like a sancocho, which is a soup. And you have so many ingredients and just teachers, you know, they pick up whatever they can because that's how they work here, but not necessarily the same in Lebanon. So that would be the other question.
Okay. Good to know. Okay. Okay, great. So I'll give you a quick idea of how the teachers are supported. Yeah. So as I said, they're supported, number one, with a framework. So for example, we have a defined, so for example, for the history teachers, we have a defined framework called disciplinary approaches to learning and teaching history. So what are these disciplinary approaches? We have, let's say, 4 concepts: cause and causation, similarity and differences, change and continuity, and significance. Yeah, and these are taken from, let's say, the UK and the US and their framework. And we then formed an association with teachers who we called high impact teachers. And these high impact teachers are the teachers that would come to those meetings on Friday nights and really go over and beyond. Then we received some bits of funding to start to have seminars. Yeah, that's probably the most difficult part, obviously, is the fundraising. But the sustainable component of this is the association, having an association. So when we set up the association, we're able to set up, obviously, the website and lines of communication. And so when there wasn't funding for workshops, we were at least talking about the association. Yeah. And we were using some of the material to continue. Again, it was kind of a lot of volunteering. Yeah. Because we're not changing teachers. Yeah. We're not this is like, we're not looking at a teacher who's forcing their students to memorize. And now we're like, no, we want you to do it another way. No, it's not that. It's empowering teachers with already evidence of innovation inside their classroom. Yeah. So the sustainability is also in that as well. And these teachers, we see them as catalysts. Yeah. So we're investing in the catalysts. Yes, for curriculum reform, teachers are often recruited to do the writing, but not creative work. It's, look, this is what I want in this unit, so I would like you to write that, but that's it. So yes, being marginalized or, it's like, in a hospital, when a doctor is not consulted on, well, what are we going to do with this department? You're consulting somebody else who has nothing to do with the hospital. So yes, another part of the sustainable approach to empowering these teachers to innovate is that over time, and we see this in Cyprus and we saw this in the UK, is that when the government now wants to reform, they're like, yeah, I have heard of that association. I've seen those teachers present something. And let's go talk to them maybe, and let's go approach them. Yeah. So there's a bit of marketing happening there. But that's the sustainable component to it. Yeah. It's not, let's say, 100% effective, but it's better than, let's say, turning to a priest who studied history and have him write the history books. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your questions, but
I just had
follow. Yeah.
The teachers in the association, do they share like ideological background, cultural background, religious background? Sorry, do they share like their ideological background, cultural background, religious background, or are they like very different among them? Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks. They come from all different religious sects. They come from all across the country. But they do have some things in common, which are they have been, let's say, the black sheep in their family. Yeah, they have stood up against, let's say, the political ideologies of their family. They have questioned them. Yeah, and this is one common trait that we've seen across all of them. Yes, we have history teachers who have been very innovative, and they're very, let's say, religious, and et cetera. But when it comes to their political ideologies, they're not, let's say, running with blind faith. They can question it as well. Yeah.
So I have a question from the chat. So this is from Liliana, who is a PhD student here in the education program. And she's interested in hearing a little bit more about the associations as grassroots professional movements that you had mentioned that, and how the presence of an association or a structure, like a group, like a network, might be something that fosters part of the agency that you're talking about, or the willingness to take up this transformation in practice. So if you could speak a little bit more about the extent that, and I'm going to add a little bit there, which is you talk about we did this, and I'm not quite sure who we is. So if you could tell us a bit more about that. And part of the tension there is like the difference between a grassroots professional movement and, I guess, like a very effective professional development process, where you're creating ownership and something is growing out of it, and where you would situate that process in relationship to professional development and just teacher education in general.
Okay. Yeah, Lilian, good question. So I synonymize grassroots with effective movements. Yeah. Remember that in grassroots movements, they're very organic. Yeah. So it could break. And really, the way this association was formed broke along the way several times. Yeah. Because they're not accountable to anybody, yeah, except themselves. And so when someone says, hey, I don't like how you're doing that, and I want to do it this way, well, there's negotiation and there's conflict. Okay, so the grassroots movements need, let's say, a structure for accountability. So we had, we organized structure of a president and then a committee that would manage the, let's say, the movement of the association. We had a lot of members leave, yeah, because they felt that they felt uncomfortable with the, let's say, with the feedback they were receiving, yeah, with, like I said, the humility which they did not have, and so they felt it was not for them. Don't forget, teachers in Lebanon, I will say, probably in general, are very underappreciated. Yeah. So when you ask a teacher to present their work, they want praise. It's their only platform for praise. Yeah. And then, so it's really difficult to find teachers who are ready to accept critical feedback. Yeah. And so in a grassroots movement, over time, those who stay and those who leave, at the end, you start to find, you end up with, let's say, the agents of change. Yeah. Those who are ready to do the work without getting paid. Yeah. And very charismatic when they present, and invite feedback. Yeah. This is what made this grassroots movement successful. But yes, it took time and it was very, very difficult. And it was the same also, I think, with the association, if I remember, in Cyprus. They also experienced tensions and difficulties and internal conflicts. Yeah. Lilian, I'm not sure I answered your question 100%.
Interested in how that might shape the agency, like how the fact that it's a network or a structure might be part of what both cultures hope to add.
So networks or shared practices, yes, it's sometimes it's the oxygen of agency, because you will need, let's say, inspiration. You will need resources. So when even us as students or as researchers, when we're coming up with ideas, they're usually inspired by somebody else. Yeah. So, yeah, you know, and like when you go to a conference or you listen to a talk and you hear something like, oh, wait, I can connect that to maybe what I've been stuck on. And so this is why the network is the ecosystem of agency. Yeah. It's the place where you get inspired and you come up with ideas, and you also have the encouragement to go ahead and experiment. Yeah. Because there's nobody out there that's going to say, good job, well done, and accept your network. Yeah. When you come back to your network and you share it with them. And so the network is a provider of inspiration, of encouragement, of resources, and of knowledge. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question, but I am not very sure about my English. Sorry if I switch to Spanish. I want to know what kind of factors or actors are shaping the teacher agency. For example, the politics can limit it or create some coercion for the capacity of the teachers to take decisions. Or another kind of politics can fortalecer the teacher agency. Maybe we can think together what kind of things, actors, politics, or practices can strengthen the teacher agency.
Yeah. I don't know if you observed the same thing, but agency, you know how, like, I love metaphors. Yeah. So catalysts like to grow in heat. Yeah. Like yeast. Agency likes to grow in conflict. Yeah. So in times of conflict or crises, when we have an absence of resources, then there is a need to exercise agency. Yeah. So here, when teachers feel that they're not provided by something, I don't know if you know stories of teachers who bring material from home. Oh, my school can't afford paper, so I'll bring paper or pasta from home and have this is a form of agency, right? So it's the absence of resources. So you have a conflict, you have a crisis, yeah, you have an emergency. And then you have a sense of injustice. Yeah, we also noticed this across the teachers, that when they talked about why they did what they did, they would usually say it was unfair for the children. Yeah, so there was a sense of injustice, being able to identify it. So knowing what are children's rights to education, okay, and then being able to say or acknowledging, this is unfair for them, right? So I think this is also very important. But remember, we can't generalize this, because many teachers will say, well, children's rights to education is access to a book they can memorize. Yeah. So they already have their right. It's already being exercised. And so there's no injustice here at all. Yeah. Or maybe the injustice is the students are not the victim. There are many teachers who say, I am the victim. Yeah. So what agency are they going to exercise? They actually become more apathetic, and they step back and they say, once the system is fixed, once I get my pay salary set, then I'll come back in and help them. One form of agency I did not talk about was during crises. I mean, there's no time for this. But when schools were closed, there were many teachers that were, let's say, the ministry asked them to use Microsoft Teams as the new platform. Well, no, I'm sorry. You cannot use Microsoft Teams in an emergency, because teachers' laptops and phones cannot handle Microsoft Teams. Their internet data cannot handle the data needed for Microsoft Teams. Some were given computers without Microsoft at all, okay? Many homes didn't even have electricity. So the 3 digital tools that are needed for online learning when schools are closed, electricity, internet, and hardware, they did not have. Yeah. So teachers, what they did was, first thing they did was set up WhatsApp groups. Yeah. WhatsApp groups with the children, with the parents. They'd be up until 11 p.m. WhatsApping parents on homework. So no, this is over and beyond, and during emergencies. A lot of teachers exercised agency when they started to see that children were very upset in class and depressed in class. It was like the elephant in the room. I remember when I was teaching university at the time, if we had online classes, I dedicate the first 10 minutes to, okay, really, tell me how you're feeling. They all had something to say. A lot of teachers did this too. This is not part of the curriculum. When you ask students to tell you, like, how was your day? How are you doing? How is it at home? Yeah. What if you ask teachers? When I interview teachers for studies like this, my interviews run for about 45 minutes, an hour and a half, and she's crying. And, she did not want to hang up. It was terrible. The working conditions of teachers at home with children, adult children, in like 1 room or 2 rooms in the wintertime. There's no place to sit quietly. And they're responsible for all the domestic work at home. Yeah, it's been difficult. So those are barriers to agency. Yeah, but they still find, they sometimes still find a way around it. But these are the exercises of agency I did not mention. Yeah, during emergency times, during the shocks. Yeah.
So we're actually out of time. So we're going to stop there and just say thank you very much for your willingness to come and visit us and share your experience. And to all of you in the public, thank you for coming. I will share, if that's all right, your presentation, your contact, if anyone has any follow-ups they'd like to ask. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Today. What do you think?